The chilling sound of steel grinding against steel echoes across the frozen Russian landscape. From a distance, it might look like an ordinary freight train moving steadily along the endless tracks that cut through Siberia. Boxcars, tankers, and utility wagons all blend together in the familiar silhouette of Russia's vast rail network. But hidden inside, beneath layers of reinforced armor and disguised compartments, lies one of the most dangerous weapons platforms the modern world has ever known. A mobile nuclear launch system that can vanish into the countryside, strike without warning, and reappear hundreds of miles away. The West has a name for it: the Doomsday Train. And according to new intelligence reports, it may not just be a relic of Cold War imagination anymore. Russia's quietly bringing it back. The concept itself isn't new. During the height of the Cold War, Moscow experimented with what it called the BZHRK, the Combat Railway Missile Complex. These trains carried intercontinental ballistic missiles, disguised as ordinary cargo, rolling undetected through thousands of miles of Soviet territory. To U.S. satellites, they looked no different than coal or oil shipments. But in reality, they were mobile launchers capable of firing nuclear weapons at a moment's notice. The idea was simple but devastating. If nuclear war broke out, America could never destroy all of Russia's missiles in a first strike because they were constantly moving, hidden in plain sight. For decades, this ghostly fleet of trains haunted Pentagon war planners, forcing them to account for targets that might not even exist when the missiles were launched. By the late 1990s, with the Soviet Union gone and Moscow strapped for cash, the trains were decommissioned. The West breathed a sigh of relief, convinced that the nightmare of the nuclear railway had been buried with the Cold War. But that assumption now appears dangerously premature. Under Vladimir Putin, Russia has invested heavily in reviving Cold War-era systems with modern upgrades. Hypersonic missiles, underwater nuclear drones, space-based anti-satellite weapons, all have made headlines in recent years. But it's the quiet reemergence of the nuclear train that has intelligence analysts deeply unsettled. Why? Because in many ways, the train is the ultimate weapon of unpredictability. Fixed silos can be targeted. Submarines can be tracked. Even mobile road-based launchers eventually leave signatures. But trains? Russia has over 53,000 miles of rail, stretching from the edge of Europe to the Pacific Ocean. A nuclear train could hide in plain sight among thousands of daily freight movements, vanish into tunnels or forests, and reappear without warning thousands of miles away. For Western intelligence, this represents not just a technical challenge, but a strategic nightmare. Donald Trump, during his presidency and after, often warned of Russia's ability to launch sudden strikes using systems we don't talk about enough. Though he was mocked at times for his blunt language, some now say Trump may have been ahead of the curve in predicting the return of nuclear trains. He repeatedly emphasized that Putin thrived on unpredictability, and that the U.S. should prepare for the unexpected rather than assume Russia would play by traditional nuclear doctrines. Today, as reports emerge that Russia has quietly begun testing a modernized version of the BZHRK, complete with updated missiles and stealthier designs, those warnings sound less like political rhetoric and more like prophecy. To understand just how dangerous this development is, we need to step back and consider the logic of nuclear deterrence. For decades, the balance between Washington and Moscow rested on a grim principle: mutually assured destruction. If either side launched a first strike, the other would have enough weapons surviving to retaliate, ensuring that both societies would be obliterated. This terrible symmetry is what kept the peace through countless crises. But the nuclear train changes that equation. It increases survivability to such an extent that Russia could, in theory, prepare a first strike while being confident that enough of its missiles would remain hidden on the rails to deliver a devastating counterattack. That gives Putin leverage, not necessarily to launch a nuclear war, but to rattle the West with the credible threat of one. And that's where things get even more dangerous. Putin doesn't have to actually use these trains to gain advantage. The mere knowledge that they're out there, constantly moving, is enough to force the U.S. and NATO into a perpetual state of vigilance. Every intelligence flight, every satellite pass, Every signal intercept has to account for the possibility that a nondescript train somewhere in Russia is carrying a nuclear payload. That's not just paranoia, it's strategic exhaustion. America would have to spend more money, more time, and more effort tracking a threat it might never even see. And in the fog of crisis, that uncertainty could be the spark that pushes leaders toward rash decisions. Imagine a sudden flare-up in Eastern Europe, say, a clash in the Baltics, or a miscalculation in Ukraine. NATO scrambles forces, Russia responds with bluster, and then intelligence reports suggest that several nuclear trains have gone missing from their known positions. Are they moving into firing range? Are they preparing for launch? Or is it just routine movement? In that fog, a U.S. president could face an impossible decision. Strike preemptively and risk starting World War III, or hesitate and risk allowing Russia a nuclear upper hand. This is the razor's edge Putin is deliberately creating. Trump once described Putin as a man who plays his cards very close, and then throws the table over when you least expect it. The nuclear train fits that description perfectly. It's a system designed not just for war, but for psychological dominance. Every mile of track becomes a potential launch pad, every freight yard a possible nuclear base. And unlike flashy parades of hypersonic missiles or choreographed submarine launches, the train hides in silence, moving quietly beneath the radar, until it suddenly doesn't. Part of the genius and terror of the system lies in its disguise. Reports suggest that the new generation of trains are indistinguishable from commercial freight. The missile launchers are hidden in what appear to be refrigerated cars, the support systems in tankers or cargo wagons. From a satellite view, they are ghosts. Only when the roof slides open, revealing a ballistic missile ready for ignition, does the illusion collapse. By then, it may be too late. For the United States, countering this threat is a nightmare scenario. Satellites can only track so much. Ground-based sensors are limited. Even drones have their range. To truly monitor Russia's rails would require a constant, enormous investment of surveillance resources, something even Washington might find unsustainable. And this is exactly what Moscow wants. By forcing the U.S. to play an endless game of hide and seek, Russia shifts the strategic balance in subtle but important ways. But perhaps the most unsettling question isn't about technology or surveillance at all. It's about intent. Why would Putin revive a system that was mothballed decades ago? Is it simply about deterrence, a way of ensuring Russia's arsenal survives any attack? Or is it about intimidation, a signal to the West that Moscow is ready to escalate in ways others haven't even considered? Analysts are divided. Some argue it's purely defensive, a logical move for a country that feels increasingly encircled by NATO. Others warn it's offensive, a platform designed to give Putin new leverage in crises, a way to keep America guessing and its allies uneasy. And this is where Trump's prediction begins to resonate. He argued that Putin's greatest weapon wasn't just his military, but his unpredictability. The nuclear train embodies that philosophy. It's not about firing the missiles. It's about never letting your adversary sleep peacefully. It's about reminding the world, at every moment, that Russia can strike from anywhere, at any time, with forces you can't even see. As these trains reportedly begin to roll once again, the echoes of the Cold War grow louder. But this time, the stakes may be even higher. Technology has advanced, tensions are sharper, and trust is nearly non-existent. For the first time in decades, the world must grapple with a question many hoped was buried in history. What happens when the train carrying death is already on the tracks, and no one knows where it's headed? The world of nuclear deterrence has always been a chess game played in the shadows, but Russia's decision to revive its nuclear train program feels less like a quiet move and more like a thunderclap. Analysts across Washington, Brussels, and London are racing to understand not just how these systems operate, but why Putin has chosen this moment to put them back on the rails. To answer that, we need to trace the complex web of geopolitics, history, and psychology that surrounds Russia's nuclear doctrine. And at the heart of it lies a chilling reality. For Moscow, survival is not just about firepower, but about convincing the world that it is untouchable. For decades, Russia has thrived on asymmetry. Against the larger economies of the West, It could never compete in sheer financial or industrial output against NATO's collective military might. It could never field more aircraft, more ships, or more tanks. So instead, it leaned into unpredictability, cyber warfare, disinformation campaigns, shadow mercenaries, and most disturbingly, weapons that blur the line between deterrence and provocation. The nuclear train is a perfect symbol of that strategy. It's not about matching NATO missile for missile. It's about introducing a weapon so elusive, so destabilizing, that it forces adversaries to rethink every assumption they've built their security on. One of the key questions now swirling in think tanks is, how many trains are we really talking about? During the Soviet era, intelligence estimates suggested there were as many as a dozen operational nuclear trains, each carrying multiple intercontinental ballistic missiles. Today, the numbers are murkier. Some reports claim Russia may be preparing just a handful, perhaps 2 or 3, while others suggest the long-term goal could be to rebuild a fleet large enough to guarantee survivability across a nuclear exchange. But here's the catch. With trains, even one is enough to cause strategic havoc. Because unlike silos, which are fixed and finite, the rail network offers near-infinite hiding places. A single nuclear train could effectively tie down hundreds of surveillance assets just by existing. This is where Trump's warnings resurface in eerie detail. He repeatedly cautioned that the U.S. was underestimating how quickly Russia could field systems we don't see coming. His critics dismissed those statements as political bluster, but the principle was sound. America's focus has been overwhelmingly on hypersonics, cyber threats, and missile defense. Nuclear trains barely registered outside specialized defense circles. And now, just as Trump feared, they may be rolling again before the U.S. has even mounted coherent counter-strategy. But beyond the technicalities, the trains reveal something deeper about Putin's mindset. He has long seen himself as the guardian of Russia's status as a nuclear superpower. To him, the collapse of the Soviet Union wasn't just a political catastrophe. It was a strategic humiliation. Rebuilding weapons programs that the West thought dead isn't just about military advantage. It's about psychological dominance. It sends a message. Russia will not only survive, it will resurrect the very nightmares the world thought it had escaped. That's why this development feels so profoundly destabilizing. It isn't just a military shift. It's a narrative shift. The timing also matters. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has bogged the Kremlin down in a grinding war that has exposed weaknesses in its conventional forces. Tanks burned on the roadside, aircraft shot down, soldiers undersupplied. Yet through it all, Putin has leaned on nuclear rhetoric to keep NATO at bay. By hinting, again and again, that escalation could go nuclear, he's managed to prevent direct Western intervention. Now imagine layering the train system onto that threat. Suddenly, it's not just about missiles in silos or submarines at sea. It's about invisible weapons moving across a vast landmass, ready to surface without warning. For NATO leaders, that adds yet another layer of hesitation. Of course, not everyone is convinced the nuclear train is fully back online. Skeptics argue that building, maintaining, and disguising such systems is extraordinarily expensive. They note that during the Cold War, even the Soviet Union struggled to keep them operational. Trains required constant maintenance, specialized rail upgrades, and careful concealment. The logistics were nightmarish. Could Russia, already stretched thin by sanctions and war, really afford to bring these back at scale? It's a fair question. And yet, history offers a sobering answer. Moscow has repeatedly chosen to endure economic pain in order to fund strategic weapons it believes will guarantee survival. From the nuclear submarine fleet to hypersonic missile programs, Russia has consistently prioritized nuclear systems over bread-and-butter economic needs. If Putin sees the trains as essential, he will find the resources. The United States and its allies now face a grim conundrum. How do you deter a system designed to be undetectable? Satellite surveillance can be improved, yes, but at staggering cost. Signals intelligence can track communications, but Russia has become increasingly adept at masking electronic signatures. Human intelligence could help, But infiltrating Russian strategic operations is a near impossible feat. Some have suggested that the best countermeasure is not technical but strategic, making it clear to Moscow that any nuclear use, train-launched or otherwise, would invite overwhelming retaliation. That logic has worked before, under the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, but it relies on trust, the trust that Putin values survival over victory. And as his behavior in Ukraine has shown, that assumption is shakier than ever. There's also the question of escalation pathways. What happens if a train is spotted near a conflict zone? What if NATO believes, or merely suspects, that a launch is imminent? Does it strike first? Does it wait? In an era of high-speed news cycles and deep political divides, could Western leaders even muster the calm required to avoid panic? These are the nightmare scenarios war-gamed behind closed doors in Pentagon bunkers, and the answers are rarely comforting. Meanwhile, for ordinary Russians, the train program is shrouded in mystery. State media barely acknowledges it, presenting it instead as just another example of Russia's invincible arsenal. But within the secretive corridors of power, its symbolism is powerful. To Russian generals, it represents ingenuity, survivability, and a return to the days when Moscow could truly terrify the West. To Putin, it represents a trump card, one that could ensure his relevance and Russia's leverage in an increasingly multipolar world. This all raises a chilling possibility. What if the nuclear train isn't just a defensive measure, but a bargaining chip? By deploying these systems, Putin could gain leverage in negotiations, whether on Ukraine, sanctions, or NATO expansion. He doesn't even have to launch them. He just has to let the world know they're out there, rolling across the endless rails of Eurasia. That uncertainty alone tilts the strategic balance in his favor. And so, the West finds itself at a crossroads. Ignore the trains and risk underestimating a deadly new capability. Overreact and risk spiraling into an arms race that drains resources and escalates tensions. Neither option is comforting, but perhaps the greatest danger of all is psychological. If the mere possibility of a nuclear train can paralyze Western decision-making, then Putin has already achieved a kind of victory, without ever firing a shot. As we move deeper into this shadowed landscape, one truth becomes inescapable. The nuclear train is not just a weapon. It's a message that the Cold War never truly ended, that history is not safely buried, and that the line between deterrence and disaster is thinner than we'd like to admit. By the time the dust settled from the first reports of Russia's nuclear trains reappearing, one fact was already clear. This was not a temporary stunt. It was a structural shift in the way Moscow planned to project power for the next generation. And in the uneasy corridors of Washington and Brussels, military planners began to wrestle with the sobering question. If Putin truly intends to keep these trains rolling, how does the West prepare for a strike that could come without warning? The heart of the problem is speed. Nuclear deterrence traditionally worked on a simple timeline. Satellites spotted launches, radars tracked missiles, and leaders had minutes, sometimes hours, to confirm, deliberate, and decide. It was always terrifyingly short, but it was at least predictable. Nuclear trains scramble that predictability. A launch from a mobile platform hidden in Russia's vast interior could compress warning times to mere minutes. Worse, it could make distinguishing between drills, posturing, and a genuine strike almost impossible. In a crisis, that ambiguity might be deadly. Donald Trump's warnings about hidden Russian systems suddenly read like prophecy. During his presidency, he repeatedly accused NATO allies of being too slow to adapt to Moscow's evolving strategies. They're not going to come through the front door, he said at one rally. They'll come through the side, the back, underneath, wherever we're not looking. At the time, many dismissed it as rhetorical flourish, but in hindsight, it mirrors the nuclear train dilemma almost perfectly. The danger isn't just the missiles. It's the fact that they don't follow the traditional script. And Trump was blunt about what that meant. He argued that America's enemies were banking on hesitation, on leaders fearing escalation so much that they would always wait too long to act. The nuclear train fits that mold precisely. Do you strike a train because you think it might be preparing to launch? Or do you hold back, risking that hesitation becoming the fatal moment of opportunity your adversary has been waiting for? For Putin, this isn't just about weapons. It's about theater. Every sighting of a nuclear train, every rumor of movement across Siberia or the Urals becomes a tool of psychological warfare. Each report forces Western intelligence agencies to double-check, to expend resources, to second-guess, and every ounce of doubt buys Putin more leverage. The Russian state thrives on this ambiguity. It feeds directly into the Kremlin's long-standing doctrine of escalate to de-escalate. The idea that introducing the threat of nuclear use early in a conflict can freeze adversaries in their tracks. In Ukraine, that doctrine has already been tested through rhetoric and exercises. Now, with the nuclear train back on the rails, it gains a terrifying new credibility. For NATO, the challenge is twofold. On one hand, the alliance must reassure its members that deterrence remains solid, that Moscow cannot simply bully its way to victory by waving nuclear shadows. On the other, it must avoid overreaction that could spark a new arms race at a moment of already spiraling tensions. The trains complicate both. Reassurance demands visibility, the ability to detect and track the trains reliably. Yet by design, they are hard to find. Overreaction, meanwhile, risks legitimizing the very threat Putin wants to amplify. If NATO pours billions into countering nuclear trains, it plays into Russia's hands by elevating them into a centerpiece of strategy. The alliance is left balancing on a razor's edge, forced to prepare without panicking. Lost in the technical debates, however, is the human factor. Inside Russia, soldiers and railway workers are now part of a system that could decide the fate of millions. In America and Europe, analysts must carry the burden of identifying threats that may or may not exist. Knowing a mistake could mean nuclear war. These aren't abstract debates. They're lived realities for thousands of people across both sides of the divide. And in moments of crisis, the fallibility of human judgment may be the most dangerous variable of all. Consider the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The world came within a hair's breadth of annihilation, not because leaders wanted war, but because miscalculations and mixed signals pushed events to the brink. Nuclear trains introduce even more opportunities for misinterpretation. A rail convoy mistaken for a launch platform could trigger panic. A false alarm could spiral out of control before cooler heads have time to intervene. Could Putin strike first? The most chilling question, though, is whether Putin might see the trains not just as deterrence, but as a first-strike weapon. On paper, Russia's doctrine remains defensive, but Putin has repeatedly shown a willingness to bend doctrines when it suits his political survival. If he believed a lightning nuclear strike could shock NATO into paralysis, and if trains offered him the means to deliver that strike, would he take the gamble? Trump thought so. His repeated warnings were not just about surprise, but about intent. He argued that Putin's ultimate ambition was not to coexist, but to dominate. And while Trump's rhetoric often drew criticism for its bluntness, the underlying concern resonates powerfully today. The nuclear train embodies exactly the kind of weapon that could make such a gamble thinkable. The road ahead. So where does this leave us? Three possibilities loom large. Containment through deterrence. NATO doubles down on the traditional logic of mutually assured destruction, making clear that any nuclear use, train-based or otherwise, will be met with overwhelming retaliation. This path prioritizes clarity over innovation, betting that deterrence still works even in a world of moving shadows. Technological countermeasures. The West invests heavily in surveillance, AI-driven tracking, and rapid response systems capable of neutralizing trains before they can launch. This option carries enormous costs and risks fueling a new arms race, but it addresses the technical challenge head-on. Diplomatic pressure and arms control. Perhaps the least likely but most hopeful outcome would be renewed arms control negotiations, bringing nuclear trains under international scrutiny. Yet with trust between Russia and the West at historic lows, this option remains more ideal than practical. A dangerous new era. Whatever path emerges, one truth is undeniable. The reemergence of Russia's nuclear trains marks the beginning of a dangerous new era. It is a reminder that technology does not move linearly toward peace. Sometimes it loops back, reviving old nightmares in new forms. And for a generation that thought the Cold War was history, this development is a rude awakening. As the last echoes of Trump's warnings ring louder than ever, the message is clear. The world cannot afford complacency. Whether Putin intends to use the trains as deterrents, bargaining chips, or weapons of first strike, their very existence forces the West to rethink the balance of power. And so the trains roll, silently across the endless Russian expanse, carrying with them not just missiles, but questions. Questions about survival, about strategy, and about whether humanity has learned enough from its past to avoid repeating it. The answers may not come until the day the tracks run out, and the world finds itself staring into the abyss once more.